Hello students, I am pleased to welcome you to the second part of the presentation on the chapter 4 Business Continuity Planning and Disaster Recovery Planning. In this presentation, we'll look at the components of a business continuity process and the business continuity management process. It's important that you know the learning objectives of this chapter. The learning objectives, you need to know the concepts of the business continuity process, understand the key phases and components of business continuity process, which is what we are going to get into detail in this chapter, in this presentation, and also understand the key aspects of a business continuity plan in terms of the implementation, which will be covered in the next presentation. We'll also learn about the backup and the disaster recovery planning, and to learn how to audit a business continuity plan. These are the different learning objectives of chapter 4. Now, what are the topics you're going to cover in this? There are primarily two topics you're going to cover, and fundamentally we're going to look at what are the different components of a business continuity management process. In the earlier presentation, we looked at what are the key phases of business continuity planning. Here we're getting into the component level of business continuity management process. Now you'll find there could be a lot of similarities between the components and the key phases, but you need to understand one important distinction. When you look at the components, you're looking at what are the layers and the different aspects of business continuity management process, but you look at the phases, you're talking about how do you implement business continuity in terms of the phases involved, phase 1 to 8. This is what we discussed. We'll also look at the BCM management process in terms of how do you manage the business continuity, what are the process. Part of this we'll be covering in this presentation, and the next part will cover this in detail. We'll also look at the information collection process, which is the first part of the business continuity management process. Let's understand what are the components of a business continuity process. There are different stages. The first stage is information collection, where you collect the data, and this information collection is pertaining to the business impact analysis. You also look at the risk assessment. Next aspect, you look at the BCM strategy, which will focus on organizing the business management strategy, BCM strategy. You look at the process level BCM strategy and also the resource recovery BCM strategy. Now, if you look at here, fundamentally, you're talking about the BCM strategy at different levels of the management. Stage 3, we are getting into development implementation, where you focus on the management plan and the business continuity plans. And the stage 4, we'll look at testing and maintenance. Here we're testing the BCM plans, look at the business maintenance, and also audit and review arrangements which are required. Stage 5, focus on the BCM training process. You look at the needs, and this needs is pertaining to the assess needs, designing and delivering the trainings as required, and you also measure the results of the training. Now let's look at further stage. When you look at BCM management process, you want to ensure that it addresses the policies and objectives of the organization as defined in the business continuity plans. You also need to ensure that you have the right organizational structure in place with clearly established responsibility and authority. And you need to ensure implementation and maintenance of the business continuity management. When you look at organizational structure, it's important that you nominate a team who's supposed to be the project manager, who could be the appropriate seniority level with the authority and the accountability for ensuring the BCM policy is implemented and maintained. You also need to clearly define the roles and responsibility of the persons for different aspects of business continuity within the enterprise and also for various vendors. You implement the business continuity and maintenance. Here you define the scope and the context. You define the roles and the responsibilities. You engage all the relevant stakeholders as required to ensure the business continuity plan meets the enterprise requirements. You test the program on a regular basis. Let's look at some more aspects pertaining to business continuity and maintenance. It's important to ensure that the business continuity plan is current, which means it's up to date. Otherwise, an outdated business continuity plan really doesn't meet the business requirements. It has to be appropriate. You need to review and rework the business plan and update it on a continuous basis based on the tests of the business continuity, based on the needs of the business capability of the organization, based on the tests of the risk assessment, and also based on the business impact analysis. You manage the costs and benefits because implementing any business continuity plan will always require certain costs. So you convert the policies and strategies into action. Let's look at the BCM documents. These are sample documents for the purpose of illustration only. When you're doing a BCP documentation or a review, it's important you need to have the business continuity management policy. The policy is the one which is the charter for preparing the business continuity plan, which outlines how the business is going to be developing the business continuity plan. There has to be a business continuity management system which has to be articulated, which has to be prepared. You need to understand the most important aspect of a business continuity plan is the business impact analysis report, which actually outlines the different types of risks which are there for the enterprise. Then you look at the risk assessment report, in terms of what can go wrong, and you also decide different types of scenarios of risk which can happen and how you're going to mitigate the risk. And you also need to identify for each of the key business function what are the objectives to be achieved, what are the aims, and what are the activities, specific business process tasks and activities undertaken by each of the key functions within the enterprise. And you also have to outline the strategies for the organization, especially from the business continuity point of view. The other aspect is we need to look at the incident management plan for the enterprise. What are the different types of incidents which can happen and how it's going to be mitigated. Then you have the business continuity plan itself as prepared by the organization. You also look at the change control mechanism. What are the different types of changes which happen, how these changes are documented, what are the preventative action or controls which are in place, what are the corrective action or the corrective controls which are in place, what are the documentation controls which are followed within the enterprise, and how are the records managed and controlled within the enterprise. You also need to look at the different types of the risks which are there, which are documented in the risk register pertaining to the local authorities, pertaining to the local situations. You also have documentation pertaining to the schedule of the tests which are done, pertaining to different types of exercises and the result of this particular test. And you also have the incident log of the different types of incidents which are had, which are documented in the incident register. And what are the different types of training which are conducted in the organization to train employees about the impact or importance of BCP. Some more records. You should have record demonstrating the operations and what are the minimum period for which the records should be maintained, and this should be in line with the business policy. Retention of the record is also a statutory requirement. Now you also need to ensure that the documents are maintained in the business continuity plan. This aspect has to be considered what is the time for which the documentation has to be maintained. Now, records could also include reference to the different types of business interruptions which have happened or the incidents which have happened, irrespective of the lines of disruption, because you clearly know what are the different types of disruptions which have happened, and you can do what is called as a root cause analysis to be able to come to a conclusion as to what has gone wrong. Let me get the highlighter. Now let's look at the information collection process. What is the information collection process? How do you collect the information? You look at the enterprise objectives, the stakeholder obligations, statutory duties, etc. You also look at what are the different types of activities performed in the enterprise, the assets and the resources, including those which are outside the enterprise, which are provided by the vendors or the service providers. You also look at the consequence over the time of the failure of these activities, assets and resources based on the past experience, because this will help to know what has happened in the past, and this will also help in assessing and identifying the likelihood and also the impact on account of this. You also need to look at what are the different types of perceived threats which could happen, which could disrupt the enterprise. The threats could disrupt the enterprise operations, and this we are focusing on key products and services. So this is why I said it becomes critical to identify what are the critical business operations. You also look at the pre-planning phase, which will include define the scope of the BCP, develop the schedules for this, and also identify and address the issues. Business impact analysis. So this is very important because most of the questions in the exam are related to this. And also when you're doing BCP, this is the heart of BCP, business impact analysis. Now look at the keyword here. We are looking at the keyword which is impact. You need to analyze the impact. So this is what we're looking at. Assess the impact that would occur if the activity was disrupted. So it means you're looking at disruption, and this disruption, how does it impact the business? And what is the consequence of that? And based on the consequence, the criticality, you need to define how you're going to prepare the mitigation plan which has to be covered in the BCP. Identify the maximum time period after disruption within which the activity needs to be resumed, and also identify the critical business process. The most important aspects of business continuity plan is to actually identify the critical business processes. You also identify the minimum level at which the business has to maintain, especially the key operations. You identify the length of time in which the normal level of operation should be resumed, and also identify the interdependent activities in terms of the dependability on the resources, the assets, and the supporting infrastructure, which has to be maintained. Now, if you have to summarize the understanding pertaining to BIA in 3 questions, so this is what you need to ask. What are the different business processes? What are the critical information resources which are used in the organization related to these business processes? Which means you look into business processes, identify the critical business process, and based on this you define what are the resources which are critical. And also you're looking at the critical recovery time, during which period you need to have the information resources. Let's look at the risk management process. This we have covered earlier in the risk management chapter in the governance chapter in part 4. Let's have a quick look at this. What is the risk management process? Because in BIA also you need to do a risk assessment or risk management process. Identify and classify the different type of information resource or assets that need to be protected. And now in a BIA or a business continuity plan, you're looking not only from protection, but you're looking from the point of continuity. This is what I said. The same concept of risk management could be done from a different perspective when you do BCP. Assess the threats and vulnerability and the likelihood of their impact. Now, these are 3 things you should remember: threats, vulnerabilities, and the likelihood. Once you identify the elements of risk, you need to combine to get an overall view of the risk. Evaluate the existing controls which are already available within the organization, and depending on the need, you need to design new controls or countermeasures, or in this case, you can say, what are the new types of controls or planning you need to do to ensure the business continuity is maintained. And all this has to be brought to an acceptable level of risk. And you will have the residual risk where you will accept, in spite of all these actions which are taken, still there could be risk. Let's understand the definition of BIA. If you look at the key word here, it's a means of systematically assessing the potential impact resulting from various unintended events or incidents. It provides you a comprehensive and wider focused approach to the risk analysis approach. Let's look at the elements of a BIA in terms of what is contained in a BIA or a business impact analysis. First, you know that in developing a business credit plan, BIA is most critical because BIA provides the input based on which the next steps in terms of procuring the resources and implementing the countermeasures are decided. You need to assess what is critical for the enterprise to ensure that the customer services are provided as required, and helps the business understand the degree of potential loss, because through the BIA you'll be able to know the different types of events which can happen. You're also deciding what could the impact in terms of the loss which can happen when these events actually actualize. So based on this, you evaluate the different possibilities of loss and what action is to be taken. And this will help you in also deciding what the investment the enterprise has to make to build the right countermeasures or build the action for the business credit plan. Now, who will be involved in business credit plan? There are different stakeholders. The board of directors have to be involved. The senior management, executive leadership is involved. The line management is involved. The information system or the IT department is going to be involved, and the critical business survey staff are going to be involved. Although all these people are going to be involved, you need to remember each of them has a different type of scope in terms of their operations. The board of directors are primarily involved in deciding the policy. The executive leadership is in determining driving the project in terms of how the BCP is going to be implemented within the organization based on the overall strategy and the policy which is formalized and finalized by the board of directors. The line management is going to implement, and the line management has to be actually involved because the functional heads of each of the departments are actually the business process owners who know what are the different types of business process owners, and they also know the impact. The IS department, the IT department has to be involved because they are the ones who provide the different services for running the business process, which are also very critical. and they should know how to actually recover the services depending on the needs of the line management. And you also have the critical business staff who are required for ensuring that the business is running even in the case of a disaster. So you need to identify the critical staff. For example, there could be personnel which are required for the purpose of physical security. There could be personnel required for transportation of the staff. So you need to identify, depending on the need of the business, who are the critical business staff. So you find there are different stakeholders who are involved in preparing a business continuity plan or business continuity management, but each of them has got a different role. When is the BIA to be done? BIA is actually the first step in business continuity planning. It also helps in understanding the impact and helps in understanding the effect of the potential loss. Now let's look at what are the tasks to be undertaken in a BIA. First, you need to identify the risks which are there at the organization level. You'll also identify the critical business processes, quantify this risk in terms of what is the potential loss to the organization. This is the most important aspect. Identify the interdependencies of the critical processes, because one process is affected, the second related process also could be affected. For example, if sales is affected, so if sales is affected, you also need to look at procurement of purchases. You determine the maximum allowable downtime, identify the resources which are required for recovery, and also determine what is the impact in the event of a disaster. Okay. Now you look at it from another point of view. Let me just explain this from another point of view. BIA is the most important aspect, and I said in most of the exams you have questions around the BIA. So first we look at the organizational risk. We can also, based on the organizational risk, you also decide the critical business process. You also look at the risk to the critical business process, identify the dependencies, identify the dependable allowable downtime, and then you decide what are the resources required to run, and also ultimately what the impact in the event of a disaster, which will be the potential loss. Let's look at the assessment. When you do a risk assessment, you always start with a clean slate to look at what is going to happen. First, you do a assessment of what are the potential risks which can happen, which are there. And these type of potential risks could be pertaining to the natural environment, could be pertaining to the human, or could be pertaining to technology. Based on this, you do a risk assessment. Risk assessment is where you tabulate the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the impact. Based on the risk assessment, you identify the specific risks which are applicable to the organization, which means in this case, you have made a complete laundry list of various types of risks which can happen, the potential risks. You do a risk assessment. This is where you customize the risk as per the impact for the organization, as per the needs of the organization. And then you prepare the risks which are actually going to impact the organization, or which are going to be called as the relevant risk for the enterprise. Based on this, you decide what are the security and controls or the management controls which have been put. There are different types of controls which could be there. This could be the management controls, the operational controls, or the technology related controls. You should remember the technology control, whatever be the type of controls which are implemented, this should be sufficient enough to mitigate the risks. Which means in the case of business continuity planning, mitigation of the risks would mean that you're able to recover from the disaster, the disruption, and continue the business operations as per the acceptable level. Now you have the residual risks which are there still left after the implementing security and controls. And this could be pertaining to the same thing. You have the various types of risks. Now this you have decided to accept. For example, there's a possibility there's a flood. There's a possibility there is a sabotage. Now you implemented based on the cost-benefit analysis. You have implemented the controls which could be pertaining to the management control, operational controls, and technical controls. Still, there are certain risks which continue, and you have decided to accept them because the probability of the impact of this could be not very heavy, or they are acceptable for the organization. And based on this, you prepare the contingency plan, and you will define what is the scope of this contingency plan. And this is where you decide what are the risks you're actually considering for the organization. So it means you have already decided now what could be the different types of risks which could impact the organization. Even after implementing or to mitigate the risks, you decide how this has to be implemented. Let's look at the risk management process. So we already discussed this earlier. I suggest you also look at the presentation we have made earlier on risk management in the chapter pertaining to governance management, where we cover this in much more detail. The only thing I said, you need to look at the perspective. So we already covered this. There are different types of threats which could occur. Now here we're looking at all this from the perspective of BCP in terms of what is the impact in terms of the disruption and how it could impact the organization. You do a different threat assessment. There are different types of threats. We already discussed this. So you make a laundry list of all the different types of threats and look at what is going to be the impact for the organization on account of the threats actualizing. You identify the vulnerabilities. There could be different types of vulnerabilities. And you're looking at these vulnerabilities from the perspective of what could impact the operations, which could cause disruption or stoppage of the business, and how do you ensure that the business is still continued. So you evaluate the threats, you evaluate the vulnerabilities, which will result in the risk. And this risk is the risk of discontinuation or disruption of the business. You do an impact analysis. This is another perspective from which you can look at. You look at the different type of threats. It could be environmental threats or physical threats. You look at the internal threats which are there. You also look at the external threats. Now you need to remember one important factor, that the increasing risk is an account of the networking, because most of the data has become digital and we are living in a network era. So it means they say the network is the computer. So if that is the case, any person from anywhere can access your information system and cause the denial of service attack or various types of hacker attacks. So you should know how to mitigate this particular risk. Let's look at the risk assessment. You identify the assets which are there, and you also look at the critical business process and the related resources. You assess the risk, which is you look at the existing threats and the exposures, assess the impact on account of that. You also look at the cost, which increases due to the interruption, and based on that, you formulate the strategy for mitigating this risk. So this gives you the complete cycle of how risk assessment is going to be done for the enterprise. Let's look at the risk assessment. We already discussed this. There is a disruption to critical resources, and for this you need to look at what are the resources required to continue the operations. You also need to look at the threats and the vulnerabilities for each of the resources. You need to look at understand what is the threat. We already discussed this. There are different types of threats. You also need to understand the vulnerabilities. Now let's look at the risk assessment. You look at the vulnerabilities. You look at the threats which are there. When the vulnerability exploits the threat, it results in a risk. Now, what is the impact of that risk? This is what you'll be looking at here. Now, here in BCP, or business continuity planning, we are looking at there is a disruption to the business. So it means you are not able to continue the business operations, because which there is a impact on the business. So when you're doing a risk assessment from BCP, you're primarily looking at impact in terms of the disruption of the business. This is the perspective which you look at, which you need to look at when you do risk management for BCP. So you identify what are the threats, vulnerabilities, and the impact, and look at the total risk. So what do you do in a risk measures, which means you need to have countermeasures for mitigating the risk. You reduce the likelihood of disruption. Your objective could be to shorten the period of disruption, or reduce the likelihood of the disruption, or limit the impact of the disruption. These are different types of measures. Or you could go further. Based on the business impact analysis, you can identify the critical IT resources. You can identify the different types of outages which can happen, the impact, and what is the allowable outage time which is there. And based on this, you develop the recovery priorities. What resources are going to be recovered, what business processes are going to be provided, and within what unit of time. And you also decide what are the different types of controls which you can implement to prevent this disaster. So if you remember, we had different types of controls. You can have preventive controls, you can have detective controls, or you can have corrective controls. You may also have deterrent controls, which deter somebody from committing that error. For example, the hackers or anything like that. Or you can also look at compensating controls which are there in the organization. So based on this, you define what should be the recovery strategies. You develop the recovery strategies. Now let's look at the impact of the resource unavailability. So BCP is primarily about ensuring that the resources are available to continue all the business operations. Or when you look at from the point of business continuity, we are looking at, okay, all the key critical business processes, you should be able to continue despite the interruption. For example, if you look at a CBS, if there is a disaster in terms of one of the hard disks fails in the main system, still you have a backup system in another site which should be able to continue. If there is a data center which is impacted and that fails, you have a backup data center which continues the operations. So this is what you look at in terms of resource unavailability. So what are the different reasons for which you may have resource unavailability? This gives you the different possibilities. You may have the information system outages. There could be full disk crash or disk crash. There could be application crash. There could be system crash, which means the information system crashes, the hard disk crashes, or the technology, the computer crashes. There could be network failure. There could be power failure, data center-wide failure, or there could be building-wide calamity. There could be large-scale disaster like a cyclone or a thunder which affect the complete city. So when you're looking at the resource unavailability, you need to identify the different type of threats which can happen. These are all examples of different type of threats which can happen. Now let's look at what is availability. Availability would mean that you are ensuring that the system is able to continue to perform without interruption or with the minimal disruption, even in the case of a disaster. So what is meant by a service? So a service is to be available when it's ready, when it's needed, and it has adequate performance to be able to meet the requirements, even under adverse circumstances or when a disaster happens. So it means even in the case of failure, the key functions will still be able to continue and deliver value to the business. Now let's look at one question pertaining to this. What analysis should be done for understanding the degree of potential loss, such as the reputation damage, regulations, etc., enumerate the task to be undertaken in this analysis? You know, this question is primarily talking about business impact analysis. So we already gone through this. So we outlined what are the key things to be done in the case of a business impact analysis. Now remember, when you read this aspect pertaining to business impact analysis, get the concept clear. Then you find it becomes very easy to understand what is the starting point. The starting point is what is the impact of the failure of technology or the business processes on the organization as a whole. So it means based on that you define the critical business process, then you identify and quantify the threats and the risks, and you also look at the dependencies, and based on this you decide how you're going to restore. You also need to consider the downtime which is acceptable, which is allowable. You also need to look at the resources which are required to recover and determine the impact to the organization in the event of a disaster. This is primarily the objective. So how do you do a business continuity plan, business impact analysis? This gives you some examples of how business impact analysis to be done. Now the key aspect to be remembered is you need to involve the right stakeholders. There are different stakeholders, but it's critically important the business process owners have to be involved because they know what are the critical business processes and they also know the impact from their experience because they are the owners who are actually running the business process. Let's look at one more question. The same thing. What is business impact analysis? What are the tasks to be done in this analysis? We also have a question, what is the significance of a business impact analysis? Like I told you, this is a favorite question. What is the classification of critical activities? So you need to categorize the infrastructure in terms of the business functions, the business processes which are performed. You can also look at the disaster scenarios which can occur on account of various disaster causes. Let's look at business categorization. You could look at it as a vital, essential, desirable. Now this is one way of looking at it. There could also be another way where you talk about critical, vital, essential, or non-critical. The most important business process which has to be run is critical. In this case, not critical, it's going to be the vital. So the first priority is going to be for recovering all the vital operations or the critical operations. What are the parameters based on which the business categorization is to be done? When you look at the loss of revenue to the enterprise, there's a lot of reputation to the business. It could also result in a customer satisfaction, dissatisfaction, and loss of productivity or man hours. These are some of the aspects you need to consider when you look at business categorization in terms of criticality, vitality, or essential or desirable. What are the different types of disaster scenarios? You can categorize in terms of major, minor, or trivial, or catastrophic. Now, which of them has got a significant impact? Catastrophic are the one which are major in nature. For example, there is a threat, there is a flood, there is a cyclone. These are things which impact the whole city. So the type of disruption which happens in this case is going to be is going to be definitely different. So the major aspects you will have to plan for is for major type of disruptions, not necessarily the catastrophic. In the case of catastrophic, the whole city is down, so the business continuity has to be completely different, because in that case you look at how do you operate from a complete offsite, from a different city itself, from a different time zone itself. This gives you some metrics of how you can prepare a disaster scenario, where you classify based on minor, trivial, or you can also look at in terms of the major, or you can also look at in terms of the impact, in terms of catastrophic, major, or minor. Before we go, let's have a quick recap of what we discussed now in the business continuity management process. This is part 2 of the presentation. We looked at the components of business continuity process in terms of the different aspects which have to be covered, which are the elements of business continuity planning process. We looked at the BCM management process itself and looking at what is to be done. And the most important aspect we covered is the BIA. How is BIA going to be done? And the key aspect, if you have to remember in this particular presentation, there are two aspects. What are the components which are there, and also how BIA is done. And we also saw the different types of documentation which have to be collected in the case of a BIA. So I hope you got a clear perspective. Now, if you remember, the total number of pages as for the BCP is concerned only 28. And in this 28 also, there's a lot of repetition of the concepts, because the same concepts pertaining to DRP, BCP, and BCM are explained again and again. So to avoid repetition, some of the cases are skipped. But you should know what are the fundamental or the core concepts, and you should be able to pick up the fundas. If you get the fundamentals right, the core concepts right, pertaining to BCP, the BCP or BCM or DRP, whatever you call, you should know very clearly the distinction between the DRP, BCP, and BCM, what the need for a business continuity plan for the organization, and fundamentally, you know why a BCP is required. Now, you apply the 6 questions which you talked about, and you'll find you should be able to internalize your understanding. What is a business continuity plan? A business continuity plan is primarily required to ensure the business is able to continue despite an interruption, despite any disruption. And you should be able to continue the critical business operation. Why is the business continuity plan required? We know that there are various types of risks if the business continuity planning is not there. So we have got to discuss the different types of risks. When is business continuity plan required to be done? Not when the disaster happens. Now, BCP is primarily about planning, which means you need to decide proactively and decide how BCP is going to be implemented. This is where you talked about the key phases of a business continuity plan. What are the 8 phases in which the BCP could be implemented in an organization? Who is going to be responsible for implementing the business continuity plan? We said there are multiple stakeholders who are going to be involved in implementing a business continuity plan, and this starts right from the board of directors to the people who are the critical staff which are required. Now, each of these people also have a specific responsibility. In implementing a business continuity plan, you also know that you need to create the right organizational structure, which means this is an organizational structure which is carved out of the existing information, not only information technology, in the existing organization, and it will also include people from the vendor who are providing the services. When is business continuity plan you discussed? Where is business continuity planning going to be done? You will implement business continuity plan for all the critical business processes. How is business continuity plan is going to be implemented? We already seen the 8 phases, and we also saw the process, which one of the fundamental process pertaining to BIA. And we know that in BIA, we also need to do a risk management or risk assessment. And the process is generic in nature, but when you're doing a risk assessment, in a generic way, they focus on ensuring security, whereas in the case of business continuity, the focus is on the third part, which is the availability of the resources. And where we already see when, who, what, why, and how. All these aspects we have seen. I hope this has provided clarity on the subject. So wish you all the best. I look forward to meeting you again in the next presentation. Thank you very much. I suggest that you go back and look at the study material, and you find probably your study material will become a little more logical and appealing to you in understanding the subject.